Okay, now that we have found some confidence intervals, we want to talk about what can affect the width of this confidence interval. What are things that could make my confidence intervals come out either wider or narrower? So the first thing that can affect this is the variation in your entire population, like where you're pulling these random samples from. So imagine if your population itself has little variation to it. If the population that you're drawing from, like everyone is basically the same or everyone has the same opinions, then your sample will also have little variation. And if you take lots of samples from these people, then they're all going to be pretty similar. So maybe everyone is approximately the same age and you're doing a sample about ages. Well, if everyone, maybe you took that from a college campus or from a high school classroom, well, of course, like these answers that come back are going to be all very similar to each other, even if you do it over and over again. When you have something like that, where you have very little variation going on, you're going to be able to get a narrow confidence interval. You're going to be able to really zone in around that true population percentage. However, if your population that you're drawing from has a lot of variation to it, then your sample will also have a lot of variation. And if you take many samples, they're all going to come back very different from each other. When all your samples come back very different from each other, you're going to end up with a wider confidence interval because you're not going to be able to necessarily narrow it in around that true value as far. Okay, the second thing, let me erase, I've got some stuff going on down here, some extra stuff. We'll get to that when we get to that. Okay, so the second thing that could affect the width of our confidence interval is the sample size that you take. Okay, so if you take a small sample, it doesn't give you a lot of information to go by. Small samples come back very different from each other. And again, when your samples are very different from each other, that gives a wider confidence interval. However, a large sample gives you more information. So they will come back more similar to each other. And that helps anytime your different samples come back more similar to each other, that helps you to get a narrow confidence interval. Okay, the last thing that can affect it is the confidence level or the margin of error desired. So this is kind of what you have control over, right? They set it at 95%, or how confident do I want to be in this? If you want a very low confidence level, so you don't want to be super confident in your statement, then what you want is you want a small margin of error. When you have that, you have a very narrow confidence interval. Now that may seem a little bit backwards, so I'm going to give you an image here in a minute. However, if you desire a high confidence level, if you want to be able to say, I am very confident in this, then you have to in turn be okay with a large margin of error. And a large margin of error gives you a wide confidence interval. So let's see what that kind of looks like. Because again, that one seems a little bit backwards, but if you really give it a visual, it makes more sense. So down here I have different confidence levels. Do we want to be 99.99% confident in this statement? Or 99.7 or 95 or 68? How confident do we want to be in this statement? Remember that those sample proportions come back right in the center, and then you always have a plus minus amount on either end in order to get to your limits of your confidence interval. So this first one is the widest interval that there is. So this is the highest confidence. So think about making a statement. I am 99.99% confident in whatever I'm going to say next. So if I am very confident in it, notice it's got a very large margin of error. And that then creates a wide interval. but that's very necessary. If I want to be very confident in the statement, I have to then give it a broad interval. If I want to say something like, I am 99% confident that the grade I get on the next test is going to be somewhere between, I have to give that a really big range. I am 99.99% confident I'm going to get somewhere between a 0 and a 100% on the next test. I can be really confident in that statement because that's basically the only scores that there are, right? But now that plus minus is so big that I've sort of not given a lot of information when I say that. So I can be very confident in it, but it's not a super helpful statement. So that's a lot of times why we can't go too confident. We have to back down a little bit, because if we're overly confident in it, it's not really helpful. Notice then that this down here is our lowest confidence out of the ones showing. It's not that you can't get lower than that, but that's just the lowest one showing. It's got a very small margin of error. And that results in a narrow interval. So if I say something, I want to narrow that interval in. If I want to say, yeah, I think I'm going to get between a 70 and an 80 on the next exam, I'm not going to be able to have as much confidence in that statement. I might only be 68% confident that I'm going to get somewhere between a 70 and an 80 on the next exam, because I've really pulled that in, so I'm less likely to actually fall between that. So again, there's usually kind of that sweet spot. That sweet spot is the 95% that we use so often, and the reason that it is because we're pretty confident in those without them getting overly wide so that they don't really tell us very much.